I think I've said before, we're still struggling on here, trying to share with you some things that we have found in the scriptures, and especially in reference to the common practice of what I'm now calling starting churches or organizing churches. And we, I think, got far enough along that it made reference to the idea that there was such a thing as a local congregation in an organized sense. And I call your attention now to 1 Peter 5, 1 through 4. Let's see, 1 Peter 5, 1 through 4. The Apostle Peter speaking, he addresses the elders. He says, "The elders which are among you I exhort, who am also an elder, and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being ensamples or examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd shall appear, ye shall receive a crown of glory that fadeth not away." I talked about how that one time I suggested to the elders, what we would have at that time referred to them as the elders of a local congregation, that they needed to have a list of the names of the people that were, we called it then, members of that congregation, so that they'd know who they were responsible for. And later on, there arose a question, something like this. I mentioned earlier that there were about 50 different, what we called local congregations of the Church of Christ in that county. And there were just, here, yonder, and there. And the question came up about what if a man who was an elder of congregation, or an elder in congregation A, lived next door to a disciple of Christ who was a, quote, member of congregation B, and the elder came to understand that his next door neighbor, who was a fellow disciple of Christ, was involved in activities that were directly contrary to the teaching of Christ. They were, I would call it, walking disorderly. Would that man who was an elder in congregation B, elder of congregation A, be responsible for shepherding or exhorting or reasoning with, whatever you want to call it, that neighbor who was a member of congregation B? And the answer that I was given was that the elder would not have any responsibility for, or we talked about having any authority over that neighbor who was a member of another local congregation. In other words, we held, at that time, held the view that we talked so much about the autonomy of the local church, we called it, and how that the elders only had authority over those who were in that local congregation. And by the way, I didn't mean to get this deeply into it, but now during that same period of time, there were those who took the position or made the doctrine that elders had authority over all matters of human judgment, over those who they were responsible for. A lot of other things we go into, but I need to get on farther with our study about the organizing churches. But I had to come to this because it pertains to the concept of having, this one church here and this local congregation and the elders being responsible for just these people right here. And then here, say there was another congregation meeting 3 blocks down in the same city. These elders would have no responsibility for these people, and the elders here would have no responsibility for these people. And over the years and studying this, I've just come to the conclusion that we were in error on this idea. And I think the reason we got confused about it was because we had made some false assumptions prior to that. And by the way, over the years and studying, I have come also to the conclusion that most of the time, controversies and questions, problems, usually can be traced back to previous errors that's been made somewhere earlier. And as we've said on a number of occasions, when you're trying to square the corners of a building, if you're off just a little bit down here, the farther you go, the worse it gets off. So I believe that was part of our problem, a lot of it in fact. When Peter says to these elders to take, let's see what it says. Feed, it says, feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof. As I said, we labored under the concept that the flock that is among you had reference to this thing we called a local congregation, right here. And another error that we had, I think, is the idea that, as I expressed earlier, that some people were saying that the elders had authority in all matters of human judgment over those disciples that they were in charge of. I don't think that's correct. I don't think the scriptures teach that. But, and I never did think that, to tell you the truth, but there were some who argued for that. And also just a general misunderstanding of the work and responsibility of men who were described as elders in the days of the apostles. when you look at what they're, as the scriptures teach exactly what they were supposed to do, they were to feed, care for, protect, lead the sheep in the fold of the great shepherd, Jesus Christ. These people that have been collected when they believe and obey the gospel, and God adds them to that sheepfold, then I'm convinced that wherever and whenever a man who was recognized as an elder came in contact with one of those sheep, then he should care for that sheep. And I don't see any problem with that as long as you understand what the duty and responsibility of elders were in the days of the apostles. But another problem that we had was that, as I've described earlier, these churches that were organized, these organizations, these societies, developed into something that was operated like a business. And the elders were more or less looked upon as sort of like a board of directors. And of course, as I've talked earlier, they hired a man to feed the flock. They hired a man to do what they were supposed to do. So we got off on so many things there. Then it got us into more complications. But as long as you understand the real responsibility of elders, which was just to look after the sheep of the chief shepherd, then whenever one of the chief shepherd's sheep came in contact with this, I'll call it a under elder or under shepherd, chief shepherd having his other shepherds to look after his sheep, then that elder, that shepherd of the flock, was to recognize that sheep that belonged to Jesus Christ and take care of it. If he was in contact with that sheep for a day or 20 years, I don't see any difficulty with the problem of what we used to call the autonomy of the local congregation. I think the reason we worried so much about that is because we were accustomed to this idea of having these societies, these organized systems, all scattered around here, and we didn't want this society trying to tell us what to do in our society over here. But if you just see it as again, I'm going over it and over it. If you just see it as all these people that are collected by the Father, He puts them into His kingdom every time one's saved, and they're still in the world here. They're going here and yonder. Yes, they had meetings. They had times when they gathered the flock to feed them, and they had meetings for prayers and so forth. But any day of the week, wherever an elder met, or let's use the term, I'll keep trying to use the term, anytime one of these shepherds of the flock came up on a sheep that needed help, he was supposed to help him or help her. If found a sheep that was hung in a big bunch of thorns or something, or hung up in a fence, he wouldn't just go on by and say, well, that's not one of my bunch. I don't have any responsibility for that. That's somebody else's problem, not mine. I don't think it's going to hold up on a close examination of Scripture. Now, let's see if I have covered enough of that to at least kind of get you thinking about it as we continue on this idea of this problem of people starting churches and having my church and his church and their church. While I've got it on my mind, I see something that reminded me in my notes here, and then I'll try to get on with the discussion. I was in, I believe, the last tape. I think I read to you Romans chapter 1, verse 11, and about Paul, and I made the statement that Paul was looking forward to being comforted by the Roman Christians. And I said that in another place he mentioned that he wanted to impart to them some spiritual gifts. And that was just a slip of the mind there. That statement's not in another place. It's right there in Romans 1, verse 11. In case you might wonder why I said that, I just made a bad mistake. Well, not maybe a bad mistake, but it was a mistake. I want to correct it. Okay, let's see now. I think I'll go back and sort of rerun what I've already talked to you about here on the work of the elders. As I said to you, in this sort of introductory comments here, when we were having so much confusion in time past about the work of elders and so forth and the autonomy of local congregations, we call it, so as I said, I think that we had a twofold misconception that brought about a lot of our trouble. One was, as I said a while ago, a misconception about what we called a local church, and secondly, a misunderstanding of what the duties and responsibilities of elders were in the days of the apostles. You see, the local church, we called it, owned property jointly, that is, the society itself. Most of them at least owned a meeting house. A lot of them owned a preacher's house, they used to call it. And sometimes they would buy property to have youth camps. They sometimes owned orphan homes, old folks' homes, so forth and so on. And so somebody had to be responsible for all that property and all the decisions that be made with those projects. And then these local congregations had treasuries, and money was collected every time they had a meeting on Sunday, and then it was put into a treasury, and the elders would then decide what they were going to do with it. And this was taught so much and to an extent that I remember some preachers would tell the congregation that if you're going to go on vacation for a week or two and you're not going to be here for a couple of Sundays maybe, then for our assembly in this local congregation, you need to save the contribution that you're going to put in that plate here and bring it back. Don't take it and put it down yonder somewhere else where you're visiting for the worship services in some other place. If you want to give them a little bit, it'd be fine, but don't dip into what you've was supposed to give here, because you're obligated to this local congregation right here. And then, of course, there were one reason for that was because that local church had several employees. As I said a while ago, a preacher that's hired to do the feeding of the flock. There were janitors, youth ministers, assistant preachers, and so on and so on. So, as I mentioned earlier, going back over it here now, the elders became sort of like a board of directors in charge of a business. And the men that were called deacons were supposed to do most of the legwork in the material or physical matters. And my understanding is primarily what deacons did was care for the needs of the poor, the sick, and so forth. And also, I want to say again, I do remember, I understand that they had meetings. And I also understand that in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, that the Apostle Paul told those children of God in Corinth, the congregation of God at Corinth, to lay by in store as God had prospered them. He says, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Upon the first day of the week let every one of you lay by him in store as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. And when I come, whomsoever ye shall approve by your letters, them will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. Now, I'll tell you what we did with that. We took those first two verses right there, and we said, all right, it says right here that everybody's got to lay by in store on the first day of the week. And at the same time, we were always careful to explain that you need to take the text in its context. And if you'll find the context of that statement right there that I just read to you, it is obvious that Paul was trying to make up money, I'll call it, trying to gather money to take up to Jerusalem for the poor saints in Judea, who were under drought conditions and so forth, persecution. And he was asking these Gentile congregations to help them. And you can study it out and you'll find out that he told them specifically what the need was, and asked each one to give as he had ability, and to do it cheerfully, and didn't try to bind it on anyone. And then he said, we're going to take the money, and you can send some representatives, chosen persons, along as we travel to make sure that everything's above board, nobody can accuse us of dishonesty. And they did collect it and took it to Jerusalem and gave it to the, I believe it says, I don't know if it said gave it to the elders or the apostles, maybe both, and it to be distributed as it was needed. Now the reason I'm going into that is that the pattern here is, if you want to use it for a pattern, and I think that we can, the pattern is the need was identified, the collection was made, and the contribution was applied to the specific need that it was collected for. And if you follow that pattern, you don't have all these arguments about what we're going to do with this money that's in the church treasury, or what we're going to do with what we used to call the Lord's money. I think that was misnomer too. So, people who, when that explanation is given, I've had people say, oh, well, there's always a need. There's always a need. Well, yes, but a big part of that need is because it's contrived. They set this thing up like a business, like I said a while ago, where you've got hired preachers, you've got janitors and secretaries and youth ministers and all this property that's got to be kept up and so forth. Yeah, it's like a business. It's got to have money to keep it going. But we don't find that in these scriptures, as I can tell. Instead, individuals were encouraged to do good, to let their good works, to do their good works, that their Heavenly Father may be glorified. And contrary to that, what we were people were saying years ago, 30 years ago, I guess, to me, that if you wanted to buy a coat for a little poor child that it needed in the cold, you should take that money and give it to the elders, give it into the collection plate, and let the elders or somebody, deacon or somebody, go by it and buy the coat and give it to the child. I don't mean to harm, but that makes me completely ill. It's outrageous. And it's all about control. A lot of it is. Well, now, I don't know how well I did on that. I rambled around a whole lot, but we'll come back to the Lord willing someday and do more in-depth study about the work and responsibility of elders and deacons. But I couldn't avoid getting into it a little bit as we came along talking about organizing these churches. Now, the next thing I want to introduce here in the few minutes I've got left in this tape is that I don't know if you can see it in the camera or not, but you see these little flags I put in these cups? Some of them don't have a flag yet. I didn't want to put in all of them. Here's one. That's called the yellow with an orange stripe. There's a blue one. There's a purple and yellow. Here's a red flag right here. There's a green one, yellow, solid yellow. White with a red X on it. Now, that is to symbolize and impress upon your mind that these churches that people start and organize, as far as I can think, I just don't, it's possible that I may have overlooked it. As far as I know, they all have a name. And if they're going to be recognized by the state as a non-profit organization and qualify for tax exemption, they'll have to have a name. And not only that, if you're starting your own church, when you apply for that non-profit organization tax-free status, you have to apply and you pick out your name and then send it in. And if somebody else has got that name, you've got to come up with another one. And it's almost difficult now to get one. I would say pitiful. It's really not funny. It's pitiful. If you'd have to be pretty careful in order to pick out a name that somebody else didn't have, because there's so many of them. But the reason for bringing up the thing about having names is that when I start, or anybody starts an organization and puts a name on it, then that identifies it as being separate from this one that's got a different name. And to name something is to denominate it. And what I'm going to try to do now, when we come back in the next tape, I'm going to try to follow the teaching of Jesus when he said to take the beam out of your own eye so you can see clearly, to take the speck or the mote out of your brother's eye. I am fearful, and I'm just driven